This video is looking at the poem The Telephone Call by Fleur Adcock. Now you can find a copy of this poem online. It's likely if you're studying it, obviously you'll have one already. But if you Google The Telephone Call Adcock poem, then there are some copies available if you need that. I'd advise you to have a copy that you can annotate along with this and add your ideas to as we're looking at it. So I'm going to assume that you've read the poem rather than reading it, okay? And you'll know that it takes the form of a conversation on the telephone between the speaker and somebody who seems to be phoning out of the blue or unexpectedly with what initially appears to be news which is too good to be true, but then quickly turns into kind of this absurd satirical situation, and we'll look at both of those ideas later on. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, just pause this page now and then the subsequent page just to get an idea of the poem. Okay, so I've started to kind of annotate this up just so I don't miss things out, but we'll talk our way through the annotation. So when I start looking at a poem, I like to look at the title first, because most of the time the poet has specifically chosen this title. The exceptions are sometimes you get a poem is known by its first line because it wasn't titled, but here we know it is entitled by Adcock, The Telephone Call. And so we start to pick up on the ideas of the connotations of this and expectations. If you're talking to somebody on the phone, then you're missing that sense of face-to-face connection, that idea that you can't check either the veracity, okay, that's the truthfulness, or the sincerity, as long as I'm spelling that correctly, of the caller. And that both of those things are an issue within this poem. We expect, telephone calls intrude into our lives. I think now more than ever, this idea of a telephone scam is really at the forefront of all of our minds. If you are interrupted by a telephone call, especially from an unknown number, it's who's this? What do they want? So you could argue that the title actually sets up some degree of suspicion or intrusion, because it raises the question, who is the caller? Who is on the end of this interruption to life? And then looking at the opening line, they asked me, are you sitting down? Okay, and looking at personal pronouns is again another useful way into examining any poem or starting to explore any text, because here we have the kind of opposition that runs through the poem. The they and the me. We have the anonymity of the caller. We don't even know the gender of the caller. It's not a male voice or a female voice or so. It is an anonymous they, a collective they. And that is pitted against the potential kind of vulnerability of that first person speaker, that I, the me. This is something they're doing to me. So all the way through, they have the answers, no matter what those answers may appear to be, and the caller is more vulnerable, more kind of metaphorically in the dark about what's going on. And we start with a question, which again kind of invites that idea of uncertainty and what's going to happen next. But the question is a cliche, okay? And a cliche is a phrase that is was once kind of new and fresh, but is now kind of tired, overused, and comes with its own set of connotations, its own set of baggage. And we tend to say to people, are you sitting down, on the phone, because obviously if we're with them in real life, we can see whether they're sitting down. And it's a precursor, it's a kind of introduction to the idea that you're about to get extreme news of some sort. And humans being humans, the usual implication is that is going to be bad news. And the are you sitting down is based on the idea that all of a sudden you're possibly going to faint or pass out or go weak at the knees with shock. So are you sitting down kind of implies you're about to get, at best, some extreme news, at worst, some very bad news. And after they've checked on that, they introduce themselves not as an individual, but as a corporate entity. Okay, a corporate entity, a company. Right? We've got that there. Okay, and this is Universal Lotteries. And the first kind of, I guess, more surface meaning of that, it sounds like a big brand. You know, the word universal means applies to everybody or everything, you know, is kind of experienced by everybody. And therefore, you know, Universal Studios, for example, has picked that word specifically because it wants to be all-inclusive. Here, Universal Lotteries is a clever kind of name choice for this company, because later on they go to say that, you know, everybody is in this lottery, because, you know, they say later on, you know, everybody at some point has bought a ticket, and we'll look in a moment about what the ticket and purchasing a ticket represents. But we're Universal Lotteries, so on one level, the implication of a large, possibly global company with all the kind of reliability and brand assurance that you get, versus this idea of chance. You know, a lottery is a lottery. There is no guarantee. It is inherently uncertain. I'm presenting, you know, this is Universal Lotteries, they said. You've won the top prize, the Ultra Super Global Special. And this taps into our advertising language, you know, I think something with which we're all familiar, that hyperbolic promise of something, that when you drill down into it, when you examine it, it is actually really quite vague and non-specific. So here the caller quite intentionally or quite deliberately crafts their language so they don't promise the speaker anything. They use a combination of kind of questions and statements to allow the speaker, and by extension the reader, to draw those inferences. And those inferences rely on our own hopes and dreams, our own kind of connections that we desperately want to make. Because if somebody said to you, you've won the top prize, the Ultra Super Global Special, and then said, what would you do with £1 million? You automatically think that that must be the top prize. They haven't said that. They've said, you've won this prize, and then they've said, what would you do with £1 million? The two are kind of deliberately unconnected, but we make the connection. So we go from that hyperbolic language and looking at the kind of crafting of this question here, that the speaker is keen to be kind of informal, friendly, is using colloquial, so that informal language, is kind of full of kind of bonhomie, Bonhomie, that kind of jolliness intended to make you like them. And, you know, it seems to be kind of promising all of this opportunity and hope. But we are aware, I think, behind it, that they are using the language of kind of platitude. A platitude is one of those kind of empty yet apparently pleasant things that people say. It's all advertising, it's all insincerity. And then we move on to concern for the speaker's health and well-being, reaction. A series of questions, you know, and yet these are almost kind of overly intrusive questions. The caller seems to want to know every detail about how the speaker feels, and that becomes relevant the further on we move into the poem, because of what they're offering. You know, we know they're not offering this actual £1 million. And so I'm using the phrase here, vicarious pleasure or vicarious enjoyment. Vicarious is an adjective which means kind of second hand. Okay, so if you are watching somebody do something and they're having such a good time, it's making you feel happy as well, you can say you were experiencing vicarious pleasure. You know, if a friend is going through something awful and you feel really bad because of how bad they feel, you know, you are suffering vicariously. So here it's this constant pushing for detail seems almost kind of overly intrusive. this trying to derive vicarious pleasure from the experience that they're having of being told this, because we know it's all about the experience. It's not actually the money, it's the experience. We have our speaker kind of giving a series of comments about their physical reaction and their disbelief. And we get kind of form-wise, at this point, we're realising that this is a free verse poem, talking about form and structure, which is able to mimic the kind of to and fro of a conversation, going backwards and forwards. And, the focus on, or the focus of the speaker is on her feelings or his feelings, but, they're saying, this physical reaction of disbelief and encouragement from the caller. We start to get little internal rhymes to kind of maybe reflect that pace or that kind of excitement. My throat's gone dry, my nose is tingling, I think I'm going to sneeze or cry. The dry cry echo there kind of drives it on a little bit. And that's picked up in the kind of way and day of the next line, kind of almost like a sing-song, maybe promoting that idea of the fake happiness from the caller. And don't be ashamed of giving way to your emotions. So this first idea of how, important feelings are, and we're going to look at feelings as we look at the kind of point of the poem, or the possible authorial intention behind the poem. And here we have another one of these kind of, you do the work and get to the wrong place. It isn't every day you hear you're going to get £1 million. Now, we would take that one step further to understand, well, it isn't every day you hear you're going to get £1 million because you're going to get £1 million. That's a really, really rare event. But this speaker is quite accurately saying, well, yes, you've heard you're going to get £1 million. You're not going to get it, but you've heard about it. And we have all the kind of continued concern, acknowledgement of kind of extreme emotion, the ellipsis, the kind of punctuation, the caesura here, kind of, again, sort of imitating that informal, happy concern for somebody. And then all of a sudden a note of scepticism kicks in on line 26. Hang on, I haven't bought a lottery ticket for years and years. And what did you say the company's called? So in amongst the kind of feelings and the wave of extreme emotion and disbelief and likely happiness, all of a sudden we have the intrusion of reality and a note of scepticism, a note of kind of trying to think what is happening. If you are experiencing skepticism, then you are actually, I'm going to take that down. That looks better. Just double check that. I think I've read skepticism with a K. I think you can do it both ways. I'm going to go for the C because I think that's probably the British way of doing it. But if you're in America, then feel free to put a K in it. But it's that note of scepticism, that note of kind of all of a sudden, hang on a minute, creeping in there. So we get onto this idea of, haven't bought a lottery ticket. And the explanation we get is not to worry about a ticket, we're universal. And that's again, deliberately ambiguous. We're universal can mean we are universal, we are this company, Universal Properties. Don't worry about it. We're this company, you can trust us. But also we're universal in terms of we're everywhere. We are kind of ubiquitous. Ubiquitous means to be everywhere. You could talk about the ubiquitous mobile phone, for example. They're everywhere. So, this idea is generally applicable. It applies to everybody. It says we operate a retrospective, so a backwards-looking chances module, and then it starts to explain what they do. And this is where the kind of big idea of the poem really kicks in. The concept or the belief that nearly everyone's bought a ticket in some lottery or another once at least. And it's worth pausing a minute to think, well, when you buy a lottery ticket, you're buying not a ticket, just a bit of paper. You're buying a chance. You're buying a hope or a dream. because depending on what the jackpot, what the prize of that lottery is, you are buying the chance of a better life or kind of an awful lot more money. And if you extrapolate that out, okay, so this word extrapolate means to kind of keep going, keep kind of expanding that out and going and then to getting to this kind of logical conclusion. Buying a lottery ticket kind of means you're buying the desire to have a better life, and you're buying that really through the hope of getting money. So you are equating, whether you like it or not, this idea of I would like to buy happiness when I buy this lottery ticket. And that's the kind of concept that this poem is playing with. The idea that we've all at some point in our lives thought, I want to buy this dream, or I want to buy this solution to my existence at the moment. So the fact that that is universal, that is one of those, experiences that almost all of humanity has had. It moves on to kind of everybody has wished, everybody has hoped for a better life, a different life. Oh, if only I had such and such a thing, I would be happy. Sadly, kind of human psychology doesn't work like that. There's increasing evidence to show that psychologically we are programmed to not be happy with something for very long. We adapt very quickly to a new level of happiness. So if you think, oh, I will be absolutely, content forever if I can only get that job or that house or the place at that school or something, very quickly you acclimatise to the new, this is happy. And then you start a couple of weeks or a couple of months later kind of thinking, oh, but only if I had this or only had that. So we're not very good at maintaining constant happiness. Evolution-wise, brilliant. We're constantly kind of pushing for better things. It's what makes humans so inventive and so successful in lots of ways. But as a kind of individual decision, kind of sucks a bit because you're never going to be constantly and genuinely happy. But moving back to the poem, so line 35, the logistics, if you like, behind that, the idea that there is a big faceless corporation that holds all of these files on our dreams, slightly sinister, right? Could be a comment on this kind of advertising spec. I mean, Adcock is writing way, way before the advent of the internet, but if you think now in terms of our context and our ideas, the idea behind data and collection of data and transferring data is really kind of relevant to this, because they know what we want out there. And we have the first person speaker again. We've got this repetition of I, showing the impact on them. We've got the ellipsis here kind of showing the inadequacy of language. She's kind of unable to articulate, so explain what she's thinking. But then this kind of more largely monosyllabic, I say largely monosyllabic because believe messes it up, that kind of blunt, I'll believe it when I see the check, the kind of real hitting of, well, show me the money kind of idea. Then straight back with the entirely monosyllabic, oh, they said there's no check, right? And it's at that point that you kind of realise there's something very odd going on with this caller. And the explanation, experiences of what we deal in, what she has in fact won is the kind of elation, the temporary elation of thinking she's won the lottery, right? And they are arguing that in itself is a prize, because to experience that moment of thinking all of my problems are over, my life is going to change, that is as valuable or more valuable than the actual materialistic cold hard cash. So it starts to highlight the dichotomy, the tension behind what values we think we have and what values we actually have. Because there is no doubt that by the time it gets down to the bottom, the line went dead, you're kind of feeling slightly kind of sorry, well, more than slightly sorry for this speaker. You know, she thought she had all this money. It's like she's lost all of this money. And that's why the kind of poem is satirical. Satire is sort of pointy humour, spiky humour. It's humour at the expense of somebody or something. You're using the comedy to point out something that's wrong. And this poem points out maybe our inherent greed, because we sympathise with the speaker and we think, oh my goodness, how would you feel? We have that empathy. You realise that, you know, oh my goodness, we share those same values. If somebody told me I'd won £1 million and then apparently took it away, I would feel as bad as if I'd lost £1 million, even though I hadn't had it in the first place. So it is kind of like sort of paradoxical, really. She never had the money, but she feels like she's lost it. It creates pathos, that intense feeling, that intense kind of sympathy, where you think, oh, this is awful. But it is also comic. You read it back and you think, oh, well, they never actually said. So it's using not only the speaker's assumptions and limitations and also hopes and dreams and desires to connect with your assumptions, hopes, dreams and desires, because you make all the same connections as this speaker has made, and therefore you have that element of being able to relate to the poem, and therefore it's showing our shared hopes, dreams, gains, losses, in a way that brings it back to the idea of being universal. You know, this poem makes things significant because you are part of that experience as well. It applies to everybody. So looking at this, I would make sure that you are sticking with analysis of language. It's an easy poem to slip into narrating if you are writing about it. In order to make sure you continue to analyse, make sure you are referring to Adcock or the poet or the writer throughout your answer, and step back and think of those technical terms, that subject terminology that describes the choices that Adcock is making in order to create those effects. If you're looking at free verse, if you're looking at the enjambment, if you're looking at the end stopping, if you're looking at the ellipsis, the repetition of I, the monosyllables, the exclamations, the repeated use of questions, you're looking at that kind of form and structure. Look at the metaphorical meaning, what it symbolises, what it says about us all as people, as humans, with this sort of universal dream, and what she's trying to point out about this universal dream through her satire. Hopefully that helps. Good luck and take care. Bye now.